So in order for that all or none principle to be effective, we need to have energy. And as we've talked about, energy has to be in the form of ATP for our body's processes. So what we do is we have the adenosine triphosphate and we break it apart into adenosine diphosphate and then a phosphate group floating around. So once you break that bond and create ADP, it releases energy, or the ability to have energy in the muscle cell. However, muscle cells can only store a very small amount of energy in ATP. You can see in your notes here 2 to 4 seconds worth. That's arguable. Some textbooks say it's a lot longer. It can be up to 6 to 8 seconds, and also just depending on what pathway we're talking about. But it's not that long. So what you need to do is you need to be able to replenish ATP very quickly, and we do that thanks to our ATP powerhouse, or our energy factory, the mitochondria. So you can see in the diagrams on the right different ways we make ATP. This is what I was referring to, that this process here called the creatine phosphate pathway, this can help us possibly get more than 2 to 4 seconds, but not much longer. And what we do is we just kind of substitute, we use a creatine phosphate molecule to actually make ATP, and then creatine is the byproduct, the waste product. And then in the second and third photos, you can see other ways that we make ATP. Mainly glucose is going to be our easiest way of making it, and our most efficient way, and our most preferred way with our red blood cells in our brain. So glucose, and then if we have a lot of glucose that's stored, we can store it as glycogen in the muscle and liver. But main thing we're trying to get at is ATP, ATP, ATP. You need to have it in order to make energy. And then this bottom picture, you can see that there are other forms. We can have fatty acids. When you break down glucose in the cytoplasm, you get this thing called pyruvic acid. And all of that actually, or pyruvates actually, and all of that actually ends up in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria, as you can see, can spit out a lot more ATP. So the creatine phosphate pathway is awesome. It's really good. You get 1 ATP molecule per creatine molecule. In glycolysis, you can generally get 2 ATP, mainly specifically talking with no oxygen. We'll talk about that on the next slide when we're running low on oxygen. But as long as we have oxygen, we can continue the process and send this to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is what can make a lot of ATP, anywhere from 26 ATP to 32 ATP, just depending on what book you read. I'll put 30 to be a little more conservative. But if you send glucose and oxygen through the mitochondria, we get a lot more ATP. And we'll talk more about these specific processes next semester in Anatomy and Physiology 2. But for right now, ATP is absolutely essential for all muscle contraction. Okay, this is always a fun slide to talk about, weird some of you out. But another type of contraction, even after death, is called rigor mortis. And this is referring to when the body gets all stiff shortly after death. Usually it takes about 3 to 4 hours or so for this to set in. And you can see what's going on in your notes here, but the main cause, what's actually happening with this, is those pumps, those active transport pumps that actively literally pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, basically fail when you're dead. So, because we don't have any ATP to fuel that active transport. So what happens is calcium stays in the sarcoplasm and continues to bind to troponin. So yes, even though you're dead, even though you don't have a pulse or you don't have brain waves, calcium is still moving around. Calcium's not alive or dead, right? It's an element, it's atom. It doesn't have metabolic processes. So calcium stays bound to the troponin, which means myosin and actin can still get together. And what happens is we need an ATP molecule to bind to myosin to remove it from actin, as you can see in this first bullet point. So ATP is needed to move it to the resting state. The fact that we're dead, that means we don't have ATP, or we're not making ATP, right? The cells are dead too. So what happens is the muscle fibers are unable to relax and they get stuck in this kind of contracted state, and the body gets really, really stiff. And sometimes in severe situations, you can actually get movements. You can get jerks, you can get kicks or punches against the coffin. In some really weird situations in the morgue, you can actually get groans and yawns and those kind of things. And it's not that the body's haunted by any means. This is just rigor mortis. Your vocal cords are muscles. So if there's myosin actin still contracting or still connected in the vocal cords, as it starts to relax, you can have some movements and sounds, is all. But the good news is this spasm doesn't stay like this forever. After 2 to 3 days, rigor mortis does go away, and the entire body begins to go limp, and everything just kind of starts breaking down, disintegrating. So, but just a cool type of contraction that we don't always get to talk about.